Great. Thank you, Rajat. Thank you all for being here. It's a dream realized to be in India for the first time. Ever since I started this work with Michaela in 2019, been dying to get here, and I'm really leaning into it. I wore my flip-flops. So yeah, let's get into the science. So this is work based on 2 published manuscripts and 1 in prep. The first was in GRL with Adam, Michaela, and Mark Kane. And then last year, we published this work with those same folks, as well as Destiny Myers, Mike Tippett, and Fayaz Ahmed, who Marty just mentioned. And then the work that's actually most of what I'll present today on the monsoon low pressure systems is manuscript in prep. The analysis is mostly done by Yuzhe Yu, who's now starting a faculty job back in her native China, Mick again, and Wingfeng Ting. Okay, so one of the things that struck me when I first began learning about the Indian monsoon, again in 2019, was the spatial heterogeneity of the rainfall. So from IMD's quarter-degree gridded rainfall daily data set, 1901 to 2020. This is just your June through September climatology. And we see 2 orders of magnitude in the range of that mean, right? So nearly bone dry in the Northwest to 40 millimeters per day in the Western Ghats coastal band, right? So it's extremely spatially heterogeneous with this secondary broader maximum in this central monsoon zone, we call it. Many of you know this intimately, no doubt. What's striking is at the same time is that the ENSO imprint on the mean rainfall is, by comparison, uniform. So this plot on the right is the correlation of Niño 3.4 in June, July, August, September with the number of rainy days in that summer, right? And the browns are strong decreases in the number of rainy days as you become more El Niño-like. However, what we published last year was this sort of counterintuitive result given that mean drought signal, which is that your extreme daily rainfall events are actually enhanced in probability in much of the domain as you become more El Niño-like. So this is a correlation coefficient at each grid point with our particular metric of extreme rainfall we're using from this daily data set. That's called the cutoff rain rate. That comes from a literature led by David Nealon in quite a few papers. I should say, if that sort of sounds like a weird exotic metric, we've sort of swept as thoroughly as I could muster more standard metrics, and the results are insensitive to that as well as the data set used. Again, we have in most of the core monsoon zone and along that Western Ghats coastal band where there is the most rainfall climatology, you have increased extreme rain events in El Niño relative to La Niña. And then conversely, in the dry Northwest and Southeast, the opposite, less extreme rainfall events as you become more El Niño-like. We showed this in a lot of different ways. We use these region definitions. So the whole domain is this all monsoonal India. And then if I go back, you can see the borders of these other 3 regions, the core monsoon zone, Western Ghats, and Southeast India. We aggregate over each of those, compute a cutoff, and do that for El Niño composites and La Niña composites in the red and the blue. And you see larger values for El Niño, for the whole domain, for the core monsoon zone, the Western Ghats band, but the opposite signal in the Southeast. And then here we go beyond this single metric of the cutoff to sort of the whole distribution using this concept of a risk ratio. So this is El Niño relative to La Niña, how much more or less likely a daily accumulation is to exceed the given rain rate, right? So you see at the low rain rates, we have negative values, less likely in El Niño minus La Niña. That's where the season mean drought is coming from. But then as you go to these high rain rates, you get increases up to around 50 or 60% for the domain as a whole at these very highest values. What I want to focus on today in the work we have ongoing is what role do the synoptic monsoon low pressure systems have in these ENSO signals in the extreme daily rainfall? So monsoon LPSs are these synoptic cyclonic disturbances around 15 per summer. Here's a sort of a composite view of one. And they generally form in the Bay of Bengal, track west-northwest, and bring copious rainfall in the mean and in extreme events over especially the core monsoon zone. So you can see here in black contours the climatological density of tracks of these systems. And then the shading in this panel is the percentage of extreme rainfall by some other definition that is attributable by some specific method to these LPS systems, right? And it's very high, 80–90% in this eastern coast. So given that climatological association, the question is, what role are they playing, these low pressure systems, in these ENSO interannual variations in the extreme rainfall? So I will make three claims in that regard. The first is that as Niño 3.4 increases, as things become more El Niño-like, the LPS tracks tend to move. There's a shift in a sort of concentration from southeast to the northwest, and that broadly aligns with most of the extreme rain signals. Those track shifts, in turn, what causes the shifts in those tracks? You can attribute those mostly to a change in the genesis, the formation of these systems, also sort of concentrating northeast within the Bay of Bengal. And then you ask, well, what's causing that? And invoking barotropic instability arguments, it looks like there is this enhancement of the background relative vorticity over that part of the domain. That's a key part of this signal. So now let me back up all those three statements. So the change in the track density. So on the left here, we've got composites for El Niño years and La Niña years in the red and the blue, respectively. And then the right panel is simply the difference between the two in the color shading. And we see this decrease, the brown shades, over in this band here, and then increases in this band to the northeast there, right? So sort of a shift in this direction combined with sort of a concentration in the region where they tend to be most persistent across all years, most prevalent across all years. I'll say there's quite a lot of methodological choices here. How do you track the LPSs? How do you define, well, this isn't the rainfall part, but how do you associate the rainfall to them, et cetera? Which reanalysis data set do you use for a given track method? We're still working out those details, but to date, the qualitative picture here is pretty robust across different reanalyses and different tracking methods. So now we go to the rainfall associated with these, and especially the extreme rainfall. So what we've done here is Yuja has identified rainfall and associated it with an LPS, or deemed it not associated with an LPS for each day and grid point. And the color shading here is the ENSO anomaly, El Niño minus La Niña, in that LPS-associated extreme rainfall, with the greenish shades being increase in LPS extreme rainfall and the brown being decrease El Niño relative to La Niña. And then these red and blue contours are just repeating the track density changes we saw on the last slide. All right, and what you can see is, at least north of the peninsula, you have this pretty strong correspondence with the total extreme rainfall signals we saw before, right? So over most of the core monsoon zone, you have this green means increases, right? And these in turn are pretty well, there's a decent correspondence with just the simple shift in the tracks themselves, right? So comparing the shading to the unfilled contours. Okay, so then what's causing the track density changes? Now I'm showing you in black the climatology and shading the ENSO anomaly in the genesis density. So how many events of these systems are created each year? And you see the genesis compared to the tracks are more concentrated over the bay. The tracks then sort of go over the peninsula, over the subcontinent. And then in the ENSO anomaly is this west to east shift, right? With a little bit of a northward component as well. There's a technique that Yuja borrowed from previous literature wherein you can attribute changes in the track density at each location or over any specified box to changes in the track density and genesis density at every other grid point in the domain. And using that technique, that's what we're showing here in these two panels. So this is at each grid point, the contribution to the track density changes averaged over this whole box from that grid point. And we see all the brown shades here means that it's the decrease in genesis density and these points are responsible mostly for the track density decrease over this whole box. I might have said that a little confusingly, but hopefully it's clear enough. And then conversely, the increase in track density over this box is due mostly to the increase in genesis density over this part of the domain, okay? And so we have that decrease in this part of the domain due to the genesis decrease there, increase in this part of the domain due to the genesis increase there. Okay, now I'm showing in shading this would be the 850 hectopascal relative vorticity average for the whole summer, El Niño versus La Niña. And we've got anomalous 850 winds in the vectors. And it's a little faint to see, but the blue and red unfilled contours are now that genesis density anomaly again. And the thing to key in on this busy image is that this strong increase in relative vorticity at this level occurring here. And that's very much coincident with the increase in the genesis density there as well. So from the barotropic instability framework, sort of spearheaded by Bill Boos and Michael Diaz in their papers, you would expect, at least in a sign basis, and all else equal, an increase in the relative vorticity of your background to promote genesis LPS genesis there. All right? Sort of now the next question would be, now why are you getting this sort of cyclonic anomaly? Is that 12? Okay, great. Why are you getting this sort of cyclonic anomaly? And that's a great question. Please answer it for me. Okay, so that's what I argued. Let me just very briefly just talk about one other thing. There's still a role for non-LPS rainfall in this extreme ENSO signal here. So the left you saw before, LPS-related extreme rainfall and shading. The right panel now is everything that's not LPS-related by this metric. And it's the shared color bar, and so you can see they're comparable in magnitude, and especially for the decreases in the southeast and northwest, there's actually more of a clear role for these non-LPS related rainfall. And the signal in the Western Ghats, which is more indirectly related to these LPS events as well, much to be explained. And then the very last thing, the paper we published last year, we didn't talk about LPSs at all. We were interpreting this in terms of this convective buoyancy framework that Fayez Ahmed spearheaded. And the question now that we've seen this signal in the LPSs is, to what extent are they acting independently or not, right? So the paper showed the strong correspondence between the high right tail buoyancy events and the extreme rainfall events. the question now, that's an open question, is how much is that caused by these humid cores, these high buoyancy cores of these synoptic systems moving around, right? Sort of the LPS as being the dog, the buoyancy being the tail, right? Versus something more general about the buoyancy changing. That we need to sort out still. And I'll stop there. Okay, thank you.
Questions? Thanks, Spencer, for the nice talk. My question is on it appeared to me that there is an association between mean state of LPSS and the extreme rainfall that they project onto, and also considering El Nino minus La Nina. So there are three things, and it's so nice to see that the extremes project on the mean, which is modulated with by ENSO. Is that the correct picture, or there's more going on?
Can you clarify that about the...
ENSO is influencing the mean state of LPSS, and the number of time they spend on during their track directly projects onto extreme changes. Is that the right picture too?
Yeah, I would say the simplest sort of summation of the LPS results so far would be that you can think of it to first approximation as the LPSs themselves not changing so much in, say, their thermodynamic structure, their flow, and instead they're just moving within the domain, right? So it's not that they've become each individual event has become much rainier up here versus down here or something else, right? It's just that there's less of them down here and more of them up here. And each one of them brings with it a high probability of extreme rainfall events. And that's sort of the leading part of the signal.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah. So in reference to the barotropic instability enhancements about Northeast Bay. So going back to Boose's paper, we see that there is a critical strip that supports that strip that strip could pass through the enhanced extreme over central India in the plot you showed. But here we don't see that enhanced barotropic instability that could support that kind of a synoptic situation over central India. So what synoptic situation could be helpful in triggering those extremes if not the barotropic instability?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we're thinking about this more in terms of the genesis, right? The formation of these systems. And there we have a reasonable story to tell at this stage of the analysis, less about the subsequent propagation, which I think is your question, right? And yeah, certainly, at least in this 850 relative vorticity field, there's nothing that would clearly promote propagation, right? Yeah, but more generally, what synoptically would promote those tracks? I'm not sure. I guess, again, sort of analogous to what I was just saying to Vishal, it's sort of like the first approximation is the tracks themselves. The genesis has shifted and the tracks are still mostly just going to the west-northwest overall, right? And so if more of those are happening up here than down here, that will sort of be the first primary driver of the other signal.
One small clarification, like is there a threshold for the rainfall that you take for the extreme precipitation? Like what IMD uses, sort of 200 millimeters in 24 hours, or it is something based on a different threshold?
For the LPS results, we're not using this cutoff thing. Yuja U, I should say, is the one that's done all the actual analyses. It's like 95th percentile of the local on a sort of pointwise basis. Yeah. And there's more, as I mentioned, we'd like to be a little tighter on the sensitivities, but yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on how this reconciles with Enso monsoon weakening teleconnection, because you took like 120 years data, right? And you didn't divide it into any parts or anything.
Yeah. So the LPS stuff is all satellite era because we're relying heavily on the reanalyses. The extreme rainfall event results themselves, the signals, the ENSO signal is actually more consistent over that whole 120-year period than is the ENSO mean rain relationship, right? So you're referring to this weakening of that sort of drought, mean drought imprint of El Nino, right? Yeah, so that was sort of a nice result that came out of this too, was that actually the extreme rain El Nino connection seems to be more stable in time than the mean, than the El Nino mean rain connection. Why that is, we haven't thought that much about. There is one, and then the last thing to say is that there is this interesting question, however, is insofar as we have an overall mean warming of the background, right? And in general, that we expect that sort of globally at least to increase the fraction of rain that's coming in heavy events, right? Could it be that you're getting more of your mean rain, more of your total rain is coming from these extreme events, which are then responding more positively to El Nino, right? And then that would sort of itself weaken the mean drought signal. That's totally speculative, but.
I mean, there are studies that say widespread extremes has increased. The connection
Yeah, I'd have to think about that, but yeah.
Okay, I think in the interest of time, let's thank the speaker again.
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for having me. I'm really sorry I couldn't be there in person. The topic I'm going to talk about today is the doldrums, and I just want to start by acknowledging the co-authors who majorly contributed to this work. So first things first, what actually are the doldrums? So this is the first meteorological map that was ever drawn. It was drawn at the end of the 17th century, and it sort of maps out the trade wind regions. Yeah, sorry, there's a slight bug in the slide, but it maps out the trade wind regions, and you can actually usually see the entire globe. But if you zoom into the tropical Atlantic, and that's also the area I'm going to talk about today, then you see there's one region that sort of received a name on this map, and it's this region in the Eastern Atlantic called calms and tornadoes. And this description actually already captures quite well what the doldrums are, because if you think of tornadoes, kind of replace them in your head with thunderstorms, it's like an old English word for thunderstorms, then the doldrums are basically located within the tropical rain belt, so you have frequent strong rain showers, but at the same time you also often have these extended periods of very low wind speeds. And if you're sailing, of course, this is a bit problematic because you rely on the wind. So during sort of the age of sail, people are really interested in the doldrums. But so now we're not so much dependent on sailing anymore. So why should we still care about the doldrums? And I think the key reason is that you all know is the surface winds play a key role in coupling the ocean to the atmosphere. And so if the wind speeds go away, that kind of has two effects. On the one hand, it sort of helps the ocean to heat up. And Laura Riches has nicely shown that this can be a key driver for coral bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef. So just during these low wind speed events, the oceans get very hot, and then the corals are more likely to die. And sort of the opposite coin of this, the opposite side of this coin has been highlighted by Hans Segura, who looked at global storm resolving models. And he found that if you got these low wind speed regions wrong, you actually get the global precipitation distribution wrong. So he showed that basically ICAN tends to overrepresent these low wind speed event regions, And that leads to major precipitation biases in the Western Pacific. Oh yeah, and maybe just for what am I showing actually on the left-hand side? On the left-hand side, you can just see basically two snapshots of what these doldrums can look like for two different seasons. So in the colors, you see the surface wind speeds, and you can see these sort of over the ocean, this sort of band of region where sometimes the winds go away. So we've known about the doldrums for a really long time, and the doldrums sort of still seem to matter. So what actually causes them? And if you just Google them, then you'll come up, like you'll get to this NOAA webpage, which gives a very sort of intuitive explanation for why you have the doldrums. And it says, because the air circulates in an upward direction. So it's maybe not the most physical way of thinking about it, but sort of the idea is, okay, the air is kind of going up, so there's not much happening at the surface anymore. So that's why the surface winds go away. And you can frame that a bit more theoretically, maybe, in an argument that was that I found in this paper by Durst in 1924, where he says, well, the doldrums are sort of the surface, like they're sort of the footprint of the ITZ. And so what happens is the ITZ happens in the equatorial trough, of course. So that means the meridional pressure gradient goes to zero. And that by geostrophic balance means the zonal wind speed goes to zero. So one component of the wind speed sort of down. And then the sort of analogous argument for the meridional wind speed is the ITZ is the region where the trade winds converge. So at one point, the meridional wind speed has to go to zero. So this all kind of seems to make sense. So we expect the doldrums to be sort of, if we expect the doldrums to be the surface footprint of the ITZ, then it's where the air goes up. And so it's where we expect strong surface convergence, deep convection, rain. Because of course we're in the deep tropics, so any kind of convergence should actually have some impact on the cloud field. But this is what the doldrums actually look like when you when you're there on a research vessel. So this is a picture that was taken in 2023 during a campaign, and so we had more than half a day, basically almost no wind at all. And so what happened was the ocean became extremely flat because you don't have any winds. And the thing I want to highlight is not that the only ripples that are produced here were produced by this flying fish, but the fact that there wasn't actually any deep convection happening. So we were in the doldrums, but where are the deep clouds? Where's the rain? And so I got curious about this and asked, like, so how can we resolve this conundrum? So why do we not see deep convection in the doldrums? And so the first question I asked is, well, are the doldrums actually marking a region of mean convergence? And the answer to this question is yes. So what you can see on the right-hand side is in colors, you see how often do the wind speeds, or how often do we have wind speeds less than 3 meters per second in reanalysis data. And I show this for like one longitude in sort of the Eastern Atlantic as a function of the time of year and as a function of latitude. And you can see, as expected, sort of the doldrums kind of matching the ITZ. You can see they do a seasonal cycle, and then you can compare that to the region of mean convergence, which is shown by this solid line. And you show, okay, between these solid lines, that's where you have convergence, and between the solid lines is also where you have the doldrums. And you can do the same exercise for high precipitation rate, and you can see, like, yeah, the doldrums are really in this region that you would expect. Surface convergence, high precipitation rate. So this doesn't really help explain this picture that I showed before. So the next thing I did is ask, well, on shorter timescales, do the doldrums occur in region of convergence? And to look at this, I looked at observational data. So I looked at 3 buoys. Again, they are located at 23 degrees west, and they're part of the Pirata buoy array. And for each buoy, I detect around 400 low wind speed events. And I say, okay, these low wind speed events have to sort of last a certain time, in this case, just 6 hours. And then I see what's the time evolution of precipitation. So from the buoys, I don't get any measure of convergence, but again, by this argument that if you have strong surface convergence in the deep tropics, that should eventually lead to precipitation. Maybe you can use precipitation as a proxy for convergence. And so the 3 lines are the 3 different buoys. And just think of 0 as that's where all the low wind speed events start, and Tn, that's where all the low wind speed events end. And you can guess that not all the low wind speed events took the same amount of time. So I did some sort of stretching and squeezing to make them all last the same duration. And you can see 2 things. The one thing is there's no rain in the doldrums. So that matches really well this picture that I showed you earlier. So during the doldrums, the rain really basically goes to 0. And the other thing you see is like, but these events do still occur within the tropical rain belt. So because before and after, you're actually in a region where it usually rains a lot. And so this led to this kind of revised view on what causes the doldrums. Well, traditionally, we think of the doldrums as being marked by rising air. But so the hypothesis that came out of this work was like, maybe the air is actually sinking in the doldrums. And so if you come up with a hypothesis that sort of questions sort of a standard assumption that many people have in their head, you maybe want to test it with observations. And this is exactly what we did during a recent field campaign. I mean, obviously it wasn't the only question we addressed, but it was one of the questions that I was particularly interested in. And the field campaign is the orchestra campaign. It took place in August and September in 24. And I don't want to say so much about it. If you want more information or if you're interested in the data, just scan this QR code or Google orchestra actually, and you can find details. But maybe the key thing to highlight is it was over the tropical Atlantic. We had 3 research aircraft, a research vessel, 2 observatories, and EarthCare wasn't launched because of the campaign, but we made EarthCare quite an integral part of the campaign. So that kind of became important for us as well. And so how can you test whether the air is subsiding in the doldrums? And sorry for the problem with this title here. What we did is we defined doldrum circles. And so what do I mean by doldrum circles? So important to note is that the German research aircraft Halo flew circles, dropping sondes. And the main purpose of this was actually that you could use these sondes to vertically integrate the vertical, the convergence and the divergence, and so infer the vertical motion within this circle. So think of all of these sort of circles that you can see here as giving you one averaged vertical motion profile. And so we launched a lot of sondes. You can see all the different sondes marked by these dots. And sorry, there's something wrong with this PDF. And so then basically you can imagine what we did, right? We had all these sondes. We could mark the ones that had low surface wind speeds, and then we identified the circles that had sort of enough low circle wind speeds, and then we have doldrum circles against non-doldrum circles. And in the end, it sort of averaged that we have out of our 89 circles, we get 19 doldrum circles and 70 non-doldrum circles. And so then you can just ask this basic questions. Well, is the air in the doldrums subsiding? And you see yes. So what you see in the blue color is the doldrum circles, and what you see in the red color is the non-doldrum circles. You have to be a bit careful here because you sample like different numbers of these different vertical motion profiles, and we all know the vertical motion profiles in the deep tropics is highly non-Gaussian, and so you actually also want to include the percentiles, but given the way this has worked so far, unfortunately the percentiles are not showing up. So I'm sorry again, but what actually happens is the doldrum circles are sort of below the variability you get from the non-doldrum circles. And so you can really see that there is subsiding motion, but it's mostly confined to sort of above the freezing level. We can back up this analysis by looking at limited area model simulations. So in parallel to the campaign, we ran a limited area model simulation based on sort of daily hindcard simulations of the Atlantic ITZ. And within the simulation, I now distribute 960 virtual buoys, and the buoys are sort of marked here on this map, where you can also see the surface wind speeds and color just for one snapshot. And so is the air in the doldrums subsiding? And the answer is again yes. So you can now, the nice thing about these virtual buoys now is that in contrast to the actual buoys, they also give you a lot of 3D information about the vertical motion in the atmosphere, and you can just distinguish times when you have a low wind speed event compared to all times. And you can see that in the orange versus the blue color, and you see again above the freezing level you have like sustained subsiding motion. And another thing that you can do now in the limited area model simulations is that you can look at this as a time evolution. So you can see, you can do the same analysis I did before for the buoys, where I say, okay, all my low wind speed events start at 0 and they all end at time t end. You can look at what does the vertical motion profile look like during this period. And what you can see is that really the onset of these low wind speed events is marked by sort of column-wide subsiding motion. And if you look even closer, then you can see that there's sort of strong downdrafts. There's a strong downdraft signal that seems to sort of start the whole event, and then there's a strong updraft that seems to sort of end it. And with this, I already want to summarize. So the thing I talked about was the doldrums, which mark these calm and variable winds in the deep tropics that sort of live in the tropical rain belts. And so while they're traditionally just thought of being this footprint of the Inter-Tropical Convergence Zone, if you actually look closely, the thing you find is that they're not actually associated with ascending motion, but with subsiding motion. And one thing that I want to highlight here is that I think this is like a nice example where you see that if you just look at zonal mean, temporal mean analysis. So in this case, if you just look at zonal mean convergence over long enough time, then you will find that this sort of traditional view holds up really nicely. But if you look at shorter timescales, sort of on like a weather timescale, you see that the two can't be connected in the way that you might assume otherwise. And with this, thanks very much for your attention, and I'm really happy to take any questions.
Thanks for the great talk. Can you tell us how you think this will maybe be used for the problem with the kilometer scale models and their parameterization, especially the connection between when you have, I guess, gustiness and rain and when you don't?
So you mean how these results help to improve the kilometer scale models? It's a bit hard to hear, sorry.
Yeah, exactly. If I don't know how those models handle gustiness. I think I saw something at EGU where they were saying that they needed to tweak the minimum wind speed, and I'm wondering whether from your results that tweak of the minimum wind speed, which used to be called the gustiness parameterization, needs to be different depending on whether you have active convection or not.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So yeah, exactly what they did to fix the bias in the kilometer scale models was to basically just artificially say, okay, even if the surface wind speeds are very low, we pretend our surface fluxes are still higher than what they should be. And so I think it's not like I don't think you can immediately apply my results to sort of the model. But what I think is important is that we want to understand why in the model they produce such persistent low wind speed events. And I think at the moment we're basically just sort of fudging it and saying like, oh, they're a bit too stable, so let's just kind of get rid of them. But I think what this work is sort of highlighting is that we might have to think about what causes these regions in a different way. And one reason might be, one thing that we are looking at the moment is that how very organized mesoscale convective systems can kind of with like really large scale downdrafts and cold pools could contribute to starting these events. And because we know, yeah, perfect. Yeah, so basically what I was just trying to say is that in ICAN, the convection is not organized enough. And so maybe because it's not organized enough, it doesn't produce strong enough downdrafts and cold pools to actually kind of start and end these and these events in a correct way. But that's all sort of a bit speculative.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Vishal from IIT Bombay here. My question is actually about the downdrafts, especially the downdrafts which mark the beginning of the doldrum regime from the rainy regime. Are they any different morphologically than the other downdrafts you see usually?
It's a good question. I actually haven't separated them and seeing are they particularly strong or anything. I can just repeat the one thing that we are looking at is whether they're related to mesoscale convective systems using sort of an MCS tracking and Pirata buoy data. And there you do see some indication that stronger downdrafts, or in that case, stronger cold pools are actually more likely to create a low wind speed event. The signal is not super strong, to be honest, though.
Okay. Also, it was encouraging to see that LESS captured this sort of an event. How common is it for an LES to get such an event?
You mean for other models or for whether the ICON model in particular?
The ICON model itself?
So I think
how easy is it for ICON model to get the switch between the rainy regime and doldrum like regime?
Yeah, I think also related to the question before, I think ICON is almost a little bit too keen to produce low wind speed events. And so there are some differences. We're still looking into exactly what these differences are. But yeah, if anything, ICON is very keen to produce low wind speed events.
Yeah, thanks. Looks interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. So in the interest of time, let's thank Julia again.
Okay, well, thank you. I hope you can hear me properly. So I apologize. I wanted to be with you in person, but this didn't work out. I think they are still processing my visa. And so I'll talk about this topic on the role of atmospheric memory in monsoon hysteresis and in the three nonlinearities of the tropical rain band migration. And this is done in collaboration with my supervisor, Jan Herter, and also Vishal Dixit here. Okay, so coming from a convection background, it's really nice to see the seasonal cycle of the tropical rain band as the most beautiful form of convective organization. And this is how I got into this. And if I try to summarize my basic understanding of monsoon, I'd say first, the hemisphere with the net energy input has to export the energy to the other hemisphere. So this is where convection, ascent, and monsoon precipitation occur. From Bordoni and Schneider, 2008, I also understand that what is necessary for a monsoon is not a land-sea contrast, but it's a land. And that is an area with low heat capacity. And maybe a bit of convection in this from the third point. Monsoon precipitation tends to form over areas of high surface MSE, and this is related to convective quasi-equilibrium. So with all this, I think we can already have a very good understanding of monsoons, but this is mostly diagnostic, so it's still difficult to build a dynamical or prognostic theory. And it doesn't really take into account the life cycle of convection per se. So the big question behind this for me is, to what extent does convection matter for monsoon properties? And so there's plenty of studies with aquaplanets, that is coupled with a slab ocean. And so even with this setup, you can already see asymmetries of precipitation with time. And this is one example here. You can see the asymmetry of time. So this is interesting to me. And if you add a land north of 15 degrees north, then you have a very strong asymmetry between the different seasons and also an asymmetry between what is pre-solstice and after solstice, if you want. This is also seen in other papers like this one, when they have qualitatively similar results. And you can see also strong asymmetries in time in this one. And so these asymmetries in time, for me, they ask the question, is there any memory in the atmosphere for the tropical rain band migration? I guess we might want to say that most of this memory would be due to ocean properties because of the water thermal inertia. So that makes sense, but is there any role for the atmosphere as well? And so the third question that I would ask there is why such asymmetry? Is it due to the flow, the dynamics, or the convection, or the boundary conditions? So I think that if I look at the strategy that I want to have here is to ask some sort of basic questions. So I will use a simple setup, aquaplanet-like, but I want to say something about convection. And so I want to be able to have a setup that I can change the resolution for. So I feel like in the field now, most people try to make aquaplanet simulations more realistic by incorporating, I don't know, land and albedo feedbacks and maybe vegetation, that sort of things. And that's very interesting. But here, I want to kind of go the opposite way and have a more idealized approach to test our understanding. And here the question is there any role for memory in this? If we just assume there's no ocean feedbacks in this. So back to my first question, to what extent does convection matter for monsoon properties? And the strategy here is first to change the domain size, and in a second step, I can change the resolution. But I'll focus on the first thing here. So first, I want to simplify the domain. So I want to have something easier to handle. So that's the real planet. And I want to change it into an aquaplanet because it's much more simple. But then this is still too big for me to run at convective resolution. So I want to take a piece of that and I want to take sort of a rectangle out of that. So this is the setup of an aqua patch. It goes from about 63 degrees north to 63 degrees south, and here is about 5,000 kilometers on the x-axis. So it's a rectangular aqua patch. And the grid spacing we have is we have a coarse version at 30 kilometers, and we are also having a less coarse version at 4 kilometers, still not so convective, but better. And today I'll present the 30-kilometer results. On the x-axis, we have periodic boundary conditions. And on the y-axis, we have symmetric boundary conditions. We keep the Coriolis force, of course, for this. And we try to run without convection scheme, so explicit, or we can add a Kane-Fridge convection scheme to compare. And the thing here is that because we don't want to have the ocean in the story, even though with the ocean, we can kind of close the energetics, and here we don't want to do that. So we have a simplified forcing of it is just a very simple function of SST with latitude. So it's the sine squared of latitude. And then we add a very simple migration of this, a cosine of time to migrate this SST shape from north to south. Okay, so if I go back to my setup, what does that mean? Just to give you a simplified idea. So I started from an aquaplanet. I picked a rectangle out of this. I use boundary conditions on like periodic boundary conditions on the x-axis. So it's as if I had a cylinder, essentially. Yeah. But on the y-axis, I have symmetric boundary conditions. So it's as if you had mirrors at both ends, at the north and south ends. And so if you put that together, you kind of have an infinite column of cylinders that go from north to south. That's kind of what we have here. Okay, so if you look at the results, so we have, again, a rectangular domain that is kind of this. And here's the SST peak in red, and you have the cold areas in purple. What we have is some tropical cyclones. We have something that looks like a convective ITCZ. Here in the summer hemisphere, we have drier subtropics. In the winter hemisphere, and we have frontal structures here. So that doesn't do too bad. And just maybe to focus on one aspect of the results here. I want to highlight that here is a Windmiller plot. So this is time from January to December. And this is the latitude, and here is the SST. In yellow, you have the maximum of SST. So you have a very smooth forcing for that idealized simulation. It's very smooth in time and in space. But if you look at the response, you have a very asymmetric response. So here it looks like for every hemisphere, there's two places that are favored for the precipitation. So here again is the Hofmüller plot from January to December. You can see that there's one position here of the tropical rain band that is about 18 degrees. And there's another position that is very close to the equator and seems to jump quite abruptly from one to the other. So there's a sharp and rapid monsoon onset, but there's also a sharp and rapid monsoon retreat in this kind of simulation. Huh? And so here we have really reproduced some very strong asymmetries in time. Huh? So this is a very simplified view. So this is kind of I want to make a simple metrics out of this. So here's one example what we can do by picking the latitude of the maximum precipitation. So here we have the maximum of the SST in red here. So you have a gentle forcing, and you can look at the response in blue, which is the latitude of the maximum of precipitation. This is also a mean, by the way. And so you can see that there is a delayed monsoon onset or migration of this tropical rain band. And then it's reaching its summer position here, and then eventually retreats quite quickly here and kind of stays near the equator for quite some time. If I want to give a number for this, there is a memory timescale or a delay timescale of that onset that is about 30 days. And you can invoke dynamical processes, sort of a regime change to explain that. So obviously you need to go from a very eddy-based, eddy-driven headless cell to a properly formed summer headless cell. But you can also add one element that is more convective-like, which is the fact that there's a long time scale of adjustment in RC in this kind of papers. There's about 15 days. And you can say there's also a role for that, maybe for a memory residence or a moisture memory. A moisture memory. So that's the kind of things that we can have here. Just to show it more directly, if you want to say that this is a hysteresis, you might want to have a hysteresis plot. So here it is. So we have 4 different metrics to measure monsoon strength, and they are all taken from the literature. And so here on the x-axis, we have the control variable in this simulation. It's the position of the SST maximum, so the latitude of the SST maximum. And here is the response variable on the y-axis. In the simplified picture, it's the monsoon metrics, so whatever that is. And you can see that depending on the metrics you choose, you have a strong or not so strong hysteresis. But in any case, you have a hysteresis. Maybe the precipitation center has the weakest possible hysteresis. And this metrics here from Zhou and Xie, 2018, and then there's like a significant hysteresis in that metrics when you compare the precipitation in the northern and southern hemispheres. Okay, so I cannot spend too much time, so I'll just go quickly here. If you compare the situation at equinox 1 and equinox 2, you can kind of see that there's a kind of a trailing precipitation. So that again shows that kind of hysteresis. Just gives one additional argument to explain yes, there might be something that looks like a hysteresis in these kind of simulations. And so there's a delay to migrate this tropical rain band here. I'll shift that one, and I'll just have one last slide before the conclusion here to compare what I've shown you up to now, which is the stop plots, where you have an ocean at the bottom, and here the bottom plots where you have a kind of land. And maybe the main thing to emphasize here is that when you have land here, instead of having a rapid retreat, you have a slowish retreat of the monsoon, and the onset is also delayed. The onset is also delayed here. So that's kind of interesting to see that you can control that retreat by changing that surface position. So it points to some roles, maybe due to the surface fluxes and moisture availability over land or ocean. So the conclusion here is that in our idealized simulations, without any ocean, we still get a hysteresis and delayed seasonal migration of the tropical rain band. So there seems to be something that we can call atmospheric memory here. And there's three nonlinear behaviors, perhaps. One would be the asymmetry between before and after solstice. The other one would be the sticky ITCZ at the equator. And then the third one would be a rapid and delayed monsoon onset. In this kind of simplified point of view on the system, it looks like the tropical rain band is better described by a regime shift between a single peak structure and sometimes a double peak structure. Yeah, I didn't quite show this clearly, but this is what we can see in our simulations. And finally, there's sharp jumps in that tropical rain band when you look at the peak, but the overall envelope has a much smoother variability. Yeah, so I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Questions? Maxime, I have a question. Did you see similar hysteresis in the total column water vapor?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at the green lines here, not the blue ones, the blue one is precipitation and the green lines are the column water vapor. So it is about the same yeah, there's only minor differences.
Okay.
Hi, this is Spencer Hill. Thanks for the nice talk. I'm wondering, when I think about the delayed annual cycle, it seems to me like I guess hysteresis is technically a way that you could characterize it, but you could also define, say, like an effective insulation, sort of encapsulating the system's heat capacity, and then just sort of think of the zero lag relationship between that effective sort of delayed and damped forcing with the response. And so I'm wondering, yeah, just sort of what the upside is of thinking in terms of hysteresis for this delayed seasonal cycle, or perhaps it's more complicated than I'm getting at.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess it's just one point of view on the system. I agree. I guess the hysteresis is relevant when you have a sort of a low degree of freedom in the system. Then you can. It's kind of nice to think about it this way. So I kind of made it as a simplified thinking. Yes, I guess. In terms of understanding, I'm not sure this is helping to say that there's a hysteresis or not, but I think it's maybe interesting to realize maybe the time scale of atmospheric memory. So maybe if you forget about the hysteresis itself, I think it's just one experiment to show that, oh, okay, there's indeed in the tropics for this particular problem, there's a time scale of about 30 days perhaps. And yeah, I guess the heat capacity makes sense to have sort of a memory or a time scale in the problem. But I think maybe the moisture also is another one. And maybe this kind of experiments that we have done, they are more trying to show that delay or that time scale coming from moisture itself. Sorry, I'm not answering exactly the question. Yeah.
Hi, this is Michaela Biasutti. Nice talk. I have two questions. For the first one, no, I guess this is the perfect slide. So in the top left, right, you see that when the precipitation is at the equator, you have this patch of really strong precipitation, and then it kind of dies off. And it's the same right after the retreat. I'm wondering how robust that is and if you have any idea where that comes from. And then the second question is, can you tell me what choices you made for the land in terms of it's a full land model, and what did you choose for vegetation? And do you see that this retreat of this slow retreat is linked to the soil moisture memory?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So yes, this is indeed very interesting, that fact that we have that strong precipitating ITCZ near the equator, then it seems to kind of die off. And then it is again enhanced back on the what used to be the summer hemisphere, and then it only migrates the second time. We are actually trying to investigate this right now, and I don't have a full answer at this stage, but it seems that when the ITCZ retreats quickly from its summer position, then it's approximately when a second overturning cell is forming. And it takes a bit of time for the second cell to form, but actually when it forms, it it tends to kill off that ITCZ that rain band that is close to the equator. And once the two cells are approximately of the same strength, then you start to have this situation when you have two peaks of precipitation. And then what's going to become that summer overturning cell or winter, I mean, that new cell for the new season, that when that one starts to overtake the situation, then it becomes again more like one peak of the precipitation. So that's kind of where we're at now. And maybe it's related also to the moisture to some extent. I'm not sure, but definitely there's a coupling here with the existence or not of one or two cells, or overturning cells. For the second question, yes, sorry, I didn't mention the setup about the land. So because here we have made the choice to only focus on the atmosphere. And so we want to, for this kind of thinking, we want to control the surface temperature. It is actually difficult to imagine an interactive soil model. So actually we couldn't quite figure out if we fix the temperature there's not so much that can happen. So we actually decided not to have an interactive land model and to just control the temperature as we have done with these ocean simulations. But what we have done is reducing the moisture availability during the computation of surface fluxes. So essentially we have reduced the surface fluxes that would be calculated over ocean by 50% and transforming that latent heat flux into sensible heat flux. So we have kept the energetics as if it was an ocean, but we have shifted latent heat fluxes into sensible heat fluxes at the surface.
Okay, if there are no further questions, then let's thank Maxime again.